Hello. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It is 12:01 Eastern Time. That would be the time here. Here where I am, that would be the time. 12:01. Yes. Good afternoon. Welcome. Welcome to some live office hours. Here with me, Dr. Shannon Coates. What do you know? That's me. Okie doke. So yes, my name is Shannon Coates, and I am a singer, an educator, a maximizer, and some folks who know Clifton Strengths will understand what maximizer means in that context of Clifton Strengths, but if you don't know Clifton Strengths, I think you can probably still get the idea. Maximizer. Just like, want to make everything the best it can be. So yeah, it's like a fancy word for perfectionist. No, it's not. No, it's not. Although that can be part of it too. But yes, just want to make things the best they can be. All right, I am coming to you live from north of Toronto here in Canada. And these are the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, and the Wendake-Neowensio peoples here. And June is Pride Month in North America. And in Canada, it is also National Indigenous History Month. So if you are so inclined, get out there and do a little listening to a podcast, perhaps, or a little reading of a book, or maybe watching of a documentary, or go into a what's it called? Museum. It's not a museum. That's what I mean. Like a science place. Maybe a museum is what I mean. I'm not sure. Go to a place where they're, especially if you're in Canada, where they are documenting the experience of Indigenous people. That might be a thing to do this month. Oh, thanks, Christy. So chic. Woo, woo, woo. This hair is the, just got out of the shower, didn't feel like I wanted to actually do anything with it, so part it down the middle and brush comb it down. That's what this hair is all about. Anywho, so what I'm talking about today is that there's no such thing as unhealthy belting. What? No such thing as unhealthy belting. And I see too that there's a little typo. Morgan, if you're watching, there's a typo in the title. There's a typo that says there's no such things as unhealthy belting, and I mean there's no such things either. So I mean maybe it's not actually accurate. And part of the reason that this came up as something I wanted to talk about this week, I posted about it on Monday, and I also reposted a really terrific post from Lizzie Clark. So if you haven't seen that, I hope you get a chance to take a look at it. Just a little breakdown of where these ideas around unhealthy singing in contemporary styles come from. Spoiler alert, it's racism, Western classical elitism, just stuff like that. So if you haven't seen that, and part of the reason I wanted to talk about that today is because next week I am doing a class on Tuesday on contemporary singing. We're going to talk about exactly what belting is. We're going to talk about specifically what we're doing when we belt. We're going to talk about mix, and we're going to work to come away from the sort of chest voice, head voice binary to kind of see what other things are happening in there, as well as I'm going to do some exercises. We're going to talk about twang versus nasality, like what's the actual difference and how we produce these sounds. Etc. So that's going to be terrific. And that's also going to be a little bit of a comparative in terms of anatomy and physiology between Western classical singing and contemporary singing, and the ways we create sounds for contemporary styles versus how we create sounds for Western classical styles, performing, singing. So that'll be a comparative as well. And that is particularly useful if you are someone, that class will be particularly useful if you are someone who has come through a Western classical pipeline, or if you were taught by someone who's come through the Western classical pipeline, or if you were taught by someone who has Western classical training. So I've worked with a lot of jazz singers who didn't go through the Western classical pipeline, they went through a jazz pipeline, but their teachers still taught them in a Western classical kind of framing. And so the teachers, so they still have like ideas around raising the soft palate and like different ways of how, like they're still not exactly clear about what physiologically is happening, just because their teachers weren't necessarily clear either, right? So that's what that is going to be most useful for. And then on Wednesday, Jess Baldwin and I are going to do a panel together on teaching contemporary styles, specifically popular musics. So in that class, we're going to talk about a little bit about like what I talked about last week in Live Office Hours. We're going to talk a little bit about, you know, how when we teach Western classical styles and musical theater styles, the way we deliver the information, it isn't just about the anatomy and physiology or the difference in anatomy and physiology, it's the way we deliver the information, the way we teach is different from when we teach popular music styles. And you know, folks who've been teaching popular music for you know, forever have been shamed in some ways, and sometimes from folks like me who have, you know, who have a Western classical model in the backs of our heads as we're teaching, where, you know, I'm the teacher and so I'm going to give you this information and I have this tonal outcome, and of course everyone needs to sound like themselves, but I know the tonal outcome, so I'm going to guide you toward what the desired tonal outcome is, versus what we do in popular music and when we're teaching popular music, which is not that way. So that, you know, folks who've been teaching popular music for a long time have, and I know this because I've talked to them, have, you know, this kind of like, I'm missing something because or there's this like shame around teaching in this specific way, when that's actually what everyone should have been doing all along. Of course it is. So that class, I think, is going to remove some shame. I think it's going to feel validating, especially for independent voice teachers who, if you're, you know, so often independent voice teachers are teaching a wide variety of singers and styles in the voice studio. So, you know, sometimes we can feel a little bit like, oops, because we're not teaching the popular music people the same way that we're teaching maybe the Western, you know, classical people. So I think that's going to be a little bit validating, that class as well. Anyway, next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, buy them both, get $50 off. Good deal. Okay, today, what are we talking about? Healthy belting. And we'll get into this a little bit more too in the anatomy and physiology class. But I wanted to say, so when this sort of development of Western classical singing, Western classical training, we kind of develop through, and we shape the vocal tract in a specific way, and we hear these kinds of specific sounds, and then juxtaposed to that, and those specific sounds that work really well for Western classical singing and that are really, you know, there's a specific coordination that come along with them, then those over the years, and this is kind of what Lizzie was talking about too in her post that I posted earlier this week, those sounds and the way of shaping your vocal tract and the way of creating like the kind of tonal outcome that we're creating, those things start to become not just the way that we do it for Western classical tonal outcomes, but they start to become the proper or the right way to sing, and they start to become the healthy way to sing, right? And so then when we start to hear belt sounds, we start to hear, you know, chest voice dominant sounds. I'm going to put all the quotations around all of these things, but we start to hear those kinds of sounds because, spoiler alert, tenors and baritones in classical opera singing, they sing chest voice dominant. That's all chest dominant sounds. Yeah, anyway. So when we start to hear those sounds, then all of a sudden we get, we get workshops and we have classes and we have all of the presentations on healthy belting. But like, the reason that we want to call it healthy belting, the reason that that works in terms of like attracting people to the class is because we're juxtaposing this sound to Western classical singing, which is like, and it's like not Western classical singing. So obviously there's an option to be unhealthy in this style, and so then we've got to really work and make sure that it's healthy, right? We've got to really make sure that this is a healthy way to sing. And so like I just live for the day when we no longer need to, describe the belting that we're teaching as healthy. No, don't worry, it's healthy belting. Okay, thanks for letting me know. So I live for the day when we don't have to describe it anymore, when we can be like, hey, let's do a belting clinic. And it's not about like whether or not I'm teaching you how to do it healthily, it's about just like learning how to belt. Daniel says, I'm an opera singer who teaches mostly pop and music theater singers, and I love how the approach in pop rock singing is focused on finding your own sound first and foremost. And I love helping students find a healthy way to produce their own sound. When I was a classical singing student, I felt like I had to spend years learning the right way before I was allowed to find my personality as a singer. Absolutely, Daniel. I think that is the experience. Yes, being a classical tenor is very similar to being a belter, right? Yes, it is. But there definitely it's chest dominant singing. It's not like we're going into head voice anywhere, right? Christy, exactly, that's my point. We don't have any healthy classical technique classes, do we? No, we're never offering like how to be a healthy tenor, like how to sing, how to negotiate that passaggio healthily, like how to sing high notes, how to sing Queen of the Night healthily. Like we never do that. We're just talking about how to do the thing. We don't have to qualify it by being a healthy way to do it. Yeah, and I want to say too that I mean, I'm talking specifically about belting here, but you'll also know that I've said this a lot and I talk about this a lot. There are no unhealthy sounds. Like there just are no unhealthy sounds. There are only sustainable or unsustainable sounds. There are only choices, right? So we have choices. So if I'm going to make a sound that is going to cause damage in my vocal folds eventually, that sound itself is not unhealthy. The sounds are neutral, right? They're morally neutral. They're just sounds. So the sound is not unhealthy. The sound is not sustainable, maybe. Might lead you to injury. Not sustainable. It's maybe a tiring sound to create, or maybe creating that sound is tiring, but it's not unhealthy. So when we're working with singers, we want to be really clear in our own heads about when we start to think about sounds as healthy or unhealthy, what are we actually thinking here? What is the background? What's the philosophy? Thanks, Wendy, I'm glad. What's the philosophy behind why I think that something is healthy or unhealthy? And so when I'm listening to a sound, so this has happened quite a bit when I'm maybe adjudicating at NATS, or I'm adjudicating, well, it almost always only happens at NATS, because NATS is really the only place, National Association of Teachers of Singing, where they'll have like adjudicated classes. And so there will be maybe in our NATS chapter, there are 3 adjudicators, so 3 teachers adjudicating a singer. And so that's terrific because you get lots of feedback. It can be a really great experience. And so then I'll be talking to someone afterwards who I've adjudicated with, and what happens in those, in NATS especially, our local festivals tend to hire folks who know the style that they're adjudicating. So our local festivals tend to be like, okay, you know music theater, so let's hire you to adjudicate music theater, and you know classical, so let's hire you to do that, and you know pop, so let's hire you to do that, right? So they tend to get those specific, but in the Nats classes, sometimes we've got, you know, folks who don't know music theater or who don't know pop adjudicating music theater and pop singers because we just don't have, right? So we've got this kind of like mix of teachers in various levels, right? So then we'll get out of adjudicating, and you know, I'll be talking afterwards, and I'll be talking to someone who has only had Western classical training and who only trains Western classical singers. And they'll say something like, oh, that was so unhealthy. Like, did you hear like how unhealthy that was? And I'm like, okay. Talk to me about what felt unhealthy to you, right? What was unhealthy? Like, I could almost not stand to listen to it. These are actual words out of my colleagues' faces. God love them. I love them. And you know, like so I was like, my shoulders were up to my ears. So like, what was unhealthy about it? And they'll say, oh, but it was so pressed. It was almost like they're yelling. And I'm like, have you never heard a 17-year-old tenor try to negotiate the upper passaggio? Talk to me about how pressed and almost like yelling that is. Have you never heard a 24-year-old tenor try to negotiate upper passaggio? or try to move through from a C5 up to a C6? Have you never heard that? Because trust me, you have heard pressure and pressurized singing before. You just didn't think it was unhealthy because you know in your head that that's actually just a step on the way to where they need to get, right? Where they need to get to. That's just a step on their journey, and that is a normal developmental step on the journey to getting to where you don't have that same pressurized sound, right? So the reason that you think that this singing is unhealthy due to pressurization is because you don't have a concept in your head of that normal progression, and you're like, this is the way they sing, and that's unhealthy. Nope, just a normal step on the journey, just a normal progression of learning how to create this kind of sound. Now, if you think that all music theater belting is overpressurized in a negative way, then you need to examine that, and you probably shouldn't be adjudicating music theater. But if your whole point is that it's too pressurized in this like 18-year-old that you're listening to, or 16-year-old, well, yeah, that's a normal progression on the way. It was too squeezed. Right, it was so like you could really feel like there was so much compression in there, right? Like it was just like so squeezed in there. Okay, you've never heard a 17-year-old soprano trying to like negotiate through the middle of their voice and not squeezing, and squeezing the heck out of it and over compressing in the middle, or trying to get up into the upper range and they're like, ah! Like, you've never heard that? You've never worked with a soprano like that? I'm sure you have. You 100% have. Why do you think that this is healthy and this one is unhealthy? Because in this one, I mean, there's likely a little Western classical elitism, maybe a little racism, like there's likely some stuff going on in there for sure, some internalized stuff going on in there. And at the same time, you've also worked with sopranos, and maybe you yourself were a soprano. And so you understand that there is a progression, there are things that go wrong along the way, and that's part of the journey to getting to where you are well coordinated in your instrument. You just don't understand that in music theater singers or pop singers. Daniel says, do you think that a student who only wants to belt as a singer needs to continue developing their head voice for health reasons, even if they never use it as a performer? I feel like so many pop rock singers truly only ever use their chest-dominated sound. Yeah, so I just take exception to the health reasons. Like, health to me has, I do think that that there is a good reason to develop head voice or to develop range. Absolutely, I think there is a very good reason to develop all through the range. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but I just want to make sure when we're talking about health to me has a specific, almost moralistic connotation. And so when we're talking about what's healthy and what's unhealthy, there can be so much underlying moral stuff going on. So it's not my favorite way to describe singing. Again, I think that singers need to continue developing head voice for agility, for range, for balance in the instrument, for finding new colors. There's lots of things that go on in a head voice dominant sound, if we call it that, in terms of flow, in terms of breath use, that we can then incorporate into a chest voice dominant sound, or a more, a higher pressure sound. So there are lots of things that are, that are going to be useful for the singer. It's not necessarily tied up in health for me. It's more tied up in sustainability, in longevity of the voice, in agility, in being able to access different kinds of sounds. That's what it's kind of tied up with for me. I totally agree that people who don't have experience with belting tend to be confused by the sound of belting and define it as unhealthy, but really just haven't worked with that sound before. Yes, exactly. For avoiding vocal surgery, I mean, yes and no. Thanks, Wendy. Yeah, for developing range. Yes and no. So this is a thing that again comes in where we think, okay, if I'm going to be belting and I'm going to be using those high pressurized sounds all the time, then I'm going to have to, then inevitably I'm going to be singing unhealthily and I'm going to hurt myself, and so I'm going to have surgery. And that just, again, that is not actually necessarily true. First of all, when we're training singers, we're training, if we're able to give options, so we say, hey, if you continue to use a highly pressurized sound, and I mean too pressurized, I don't mean like a sort of regular belty sound. You can use a regular belty sound, it's fine for long periods of time. Music theater singers are not injured more than opera singers are. There is a very similar level of injury in pro music theater singers as there is in pro opera singers, and spoiler alert, music theater singers are going on stage 9 times a week. Opera singers are doing maximum 5 shows a week, right? So, and there's a very similar level of injury. It's not more if you're a music theater singer. So the pressurization level, I mean, if you're using things like growls, like intense growls, if you're using things like super high intense, super overpressed singing, like overpressed, even that may not be a thing, but super intense singing, if you're just not coordinated at it yet, all of those things, that's when we say, hey, let's just make sure that you're not doing it for an extended period of time yet, because you're not coordinated enough yet to sustain that for an extended period of time. That's okay. We're allowed to say that. It's the same thing that we would say to a baritone who's trying to negotiate that upper passaggio, right? Like, same thing we're saying to a baritone who's going, like, rather than they're not coordinated yet. So do we want them singing that way for long periods of time? No. That's not the way we want them to, and they're not gonna, right? But if they do that for long periods of time, they're likely gonna tire themselves out. They can run the risk of, like, maybe even laryngitis, right? They can run the risk of swelling the vocal folds. All of those things are all possible for all singers. Chrissy says, I think there's a wild assumption that those who belt just live there in that super high pressure, and there's little to no change of diversity. Yes, exactly. The only kind of music that maybe does that is screamo, where you're living in that kind of like kind of sound all the time. No belting before the age of 16. Well, heaven help me. So there's a comment there at a course with a panel of prominent voice teachers. They all said no belting before the age of 16. And so then what are my thoughts? Okay. So this really depends on what do we mean. First of all, you can't put an age on when it's going to be a good idea to do a certain kind of sound or not. Like, you just can't. First of all, 16, anyway, yes, fine. What do we mean by belt, first of all? And I would assume, like, this is the problem, right? We do not have a good definition of belting. Right now, belt describes a specific tonal outcome. which is generally an intense sort of high pressure sound, and I do not mean high pressure in a negative way at all. I just mean there's a higher pressure sound, there's a higher, the vocal folds are coming together, thicker edge, they're all this stuff, higher pressure sound. And if we coordinate the vocal tract in the right way, that is not a harder sound to produce. It's not harder on the voice, actually, than producing tenor sounds or than producing soprano sound. I mean, this is part of the problem. This is not harder on the voice, right? This is not, so long as we're coordinating well, it's not harder on the voice. Okay, so I would assume that what they mean by no belting before the age of 16 is be careful about highly pressurized singing that is going to encourage a level of holding that a 16-year-old body may not yet be able to handle well. This is also the reason that we don't tend to train opera singers, for example, before, like, we don't tend to train that same level. We don't expect that same level of opera singing from before 16, maybe a little earlier. Again, it really does depend on the body. But part of what happens when we try to, like, before 16, if we're working on some of these sounds that require a really sophisticated kind of coordination, sometimes the body is just not ready or mature enough yet to handle it. I would not necessarily say no belting before the age of 16, because that is, I don't like those kinds of hard and fast rules. But I would, if they're saying no chest voice before the age of 16, then that's crazy. That's crazy pants. So no belting, possibly. I don't even know. Again, it really depends on what you mean by belting. If you mean like, ah, like that kind of sound between like an A and an E, like A5 and E6, if that's what you're talking about, that specific kind of sound, then maybe. But even then, there are so many ways to, like, I don't love that rule. And I think it's a one-on-one thing. And I also think this comes back to, I think, too, where we listen to a music theater singer and we say, oh, that's really pressed, that's super unhealthy. But, like, at the same time that we're training tenors who are singing really pressed and we're fine with it, right? How come some young children about 11 have a larger chest dominant sound and some do not if their physique is the same? Oh yeah, it's a good question, Wendy. It's a great question. Who knows? Coordination, muscularly, I mean, the physique can be the same externally. You never know what's happening internally, right? Like, who knows what's happening internally? And coordination. Coordination has a ton to do with this. We are coordinating this instrument that is completely internal from our brain and what our ears are telling us, right? So our brain and our ears are just like intuitively coordinating this instrument, so to create specific tonal outcomes. So, like, that coordination takes a while to figure out, and in some folks it takes no time, right? That's where we think, oh, that's the talented one. So, like, the talented kids are the ones who don't have to work to coordinate for whatever reason. They just have, like, we're like, oh, they're so talented. Well, their coordination level is terrific. I mean, it's the same with athletes, right? We have some folks who are like, oh, they're such a talented basketball player. Well, yeah, they're talented, but they're like a well-coordinated person. They're just like, their brain and their body is better coordinated. It doesn't, I mean, is there an innate talent? Maybe. It's more about, you know, well, or maybe that's just what we call talent, right? This coordination is the talent, is what we call it. Yeah, so I think that likely has more to do with coordination, you know? Yeah. Yeah. I'm still coming back to Christine, to that question about no belting before the age of 16. I can see where well-intentioned people, I mean, this is part of the reason why we used to say we shouldn't train singers before the age of 16. Why did we say that? Because we said, like, Oh yeah, Bruce, I'm going to come back to that. Part of the reason we used to say you shouldn't train singers before the age of 16, like, is because, like classical singers, is because the only kind of training that we understood was Western classical training. And so voices aren't really ready to sound like an adult opera singer generally before they're 16. I mean, there are some exceptions, of course there are. But overall, generally, like by the time, like the body needs to be mature in order to create these coordinations and to have the muscular, like there's also layers of the vocal folds, like there's lots of things that have to like be mature in the body in order to actually create a Western classical tonal outcome, right? And that generally around 16 is when we start to have those coordinations happening. And can we train toward that before 16? Of course we can. We can start training toward that for young children. Of course we can. But if we train young children as if they have a mature body and as if they are, as if they're, when we train them to sound like an adult opera singer, that's when we get into problems, right? Because the body can't handle it and we start to get all kinds of, holding. So I wonder if that's a similar, and so now we no longer say, well, most of us no longer say, that you can't train young children, because we all train young children, I hope, right? So like now we don't say that anymore. So I wonder if that has come out of that, where people are saying, oh, but, the belt sounds, there's a lot of pressurization. It does require a nice, it does require, and like there are very few young children who can sound like an adult belter. Very few who can sound like an adult belter. And so, and the reason for that is the same as the reason that young children don't sound like adult opera singers, because we need a specific kind of maturity and growth in there in order to make those sounds, and that's fine. So the issue isn't whether or not we should train belting before 16. The issue is whether or not we're training them to sound like adults or not. Like we can train all of the coordinations to have, a chest voice sound up into the upper range, or have a, let's say belt, to have a belt sound up into the upper range, so long as we're not expecting them to sound like adults at 16 and until their body is mature enough to handle it. Hopefully that's a better explanation. Bruce says, back in my college days, I was taught in a masterclass by a Met Opera star how to open up my sound with what I now call controlled shouting, which I found to be very similar to chest dominant belting in the first place. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I mean, this is part of the thing too, right? Like, so classical teachers, so often we get so like caught up in like, oh, belting is so unhealthy and that chest voice sound is so unhealthy, and then you go and train a tenor. Dude, what do you think tenors are doing? They're just using chest voice and a highly pressurized chest voice at that. It's just a slightly, it's just not quite as pressurized as our belting sound, and it's in a slightly different range. And it also, well-ish, it's actually like high tenor sound is actually like that A to C, like that A, what's that called? A5, 4, 5, 5, 5, A5 to like C6, that like, money note tenor range. That's also the belty range. It's basically the same. Anyway, I like the style in which you call out the teachers who have hard and fast rules according to age. Yeah, I just think the more we try to like, and we do this out of good intentions, right? And like, I think we're all doing this out of good intentions. So teachers are in there saying, your friendly neighborhood tenor A4. Oh, is it A4? C4, A4. Oh, C5. Oh, yeah, sorry, thank you. Totally, just ignore when I was saying like C5 and C6 before. That's like high C. Yeah, sorry about that. C5 is the tenor money note, and that's also like our, a belty range. A4 to C5, yeah. Thank you. Oh gosh, yeah, it comes from these really good intentions where we're trying to keep things healthy. We're trying to make sure we do no harm. You know how we do no harm? We do no harm by not putting binary rules on people. By offering folks choices, by teaching agency. Yeah. Should you try to teach chest dominant to young students? I think that there's no way not to. Right. I mean, I think there's a vast majority of young students these days coming into independent studios who don't have head voice, right? Maybe I shouldn't say vast majority. I'm just saying like a lot of folks coming into studios these days, you know, I'm just trying to think, did I even have any? Yeah, like they're coming in able to use their chest voice sound quite well. I think it's actually more rare to have folks who are coming in with only head voice, right? So yeah, I think absolutely. I think young singers 100%. We work all the way through the range, same way as we work with other folks, right? We work all the way through the range. Again, I think that what we want to avoid is asking young singers to sound like adults or expecting them to sound like a mature voice just because the body isn't there yet, the instrument isn't there yet. It's sort of like expecting a flute to sound like, you know, what's a bigger flute? That was a bad analogy. It's sort of like I don't know, a piccolo trumpet to sound like a baritone. It's just not possible. It's the wrong shape. Everything's the wrong shape. Okay. Every singer should be treated individually. I agree. There are some bodies, if you will, that are ready for something that other bodies, absolutely. And some folks are just more coordinated and some people more mature. Good teachers are worth their weight in gold for young, serious singers and performers. Yeah, I think so. And I think so, again, I don't love the, like, you know, like what's a good teacher, what's a bad teacher, right? I don't love that. But I like, in this case, I would say you are going to be an effective teacher if you're listening and watching the singer in front of you and you have the expectations that are appropriate for that age and stage of development, and you have the understanding that, you know what, having a pressed sound, that's not necessarily unhealthy. We're just on the journey, just moving through the journey. One of the other things that, and I think I've talked about this before, but one of the other things I think that gets in here a little bit is just like when I was going through high school, which is a while ago now, but when I was going through high school, and you know, I wasn't at an arts high school, but I was at a school, it wasn't a designated art school, but a very, very healthy and robust choirs and music theater and acting and drama programs, so and bands and all that stuff, very robust. Lots and lots of professional musicians of my age in my area from that high school. Terrific shout out to Anu Slanetsky if you're out there. So in those choirs, we did do some contemporary singing, and certainly we did some more contemporary musicals, but no, this is going back 30 years, so they weren't like, they're not contemporary anymore. But we weren't all singing classical all the time, certainly. But there was, you know, there was like an emphasis on this more classical, and we were all, any of us who were taking voice lessons were taking classical voice lessons. None of us, there was nobody doing stuff that wasn't classical. So we heard, you know, like I grew up hearing, you know, some of the folks who are out there singing right now on stages all over the place, and then I did an undergraduate degree in performance voice, and so I grew up and I went through I heard what tenors sound like as they're figuring out how to sing. I heard what baritones sound like. I heard what basses sound like. I heard what sopranos sound like. Obviously, I heard what a mezzo sounds like. Like I heard what all of these voices sound like, and as they're on their journey, and I know what they sound like now as professional singers. So I have this understanding, and I feel like there are a lot of folks in my generation, especially maybe the generation below, who have this, like, we're kind of like cool, right? We're like, okay, yeah, that's an appropriate sound on the journey to figuring out how to sing this way. Like, that's appropriate. And we're not scared by those sounds. We don't think they're unhealthy, because we're just like, okay, well, it's appropriate. This is, you know, I remember when blah, blah, blah sang that way, you know? And now look at them, they're at the Met. So, but we didn't have that same experience with rock singers. Right? There weren't, in my choirs, we didn't have any rock singers. We didn't do any rock singing. We didn't do any music theater, that kind of music theater. We did like the Fantastics, and we did like, you know, we didn't do that kind of music theater. So I never had those like stages necessarily in my ears. And even the music theater, like, you know, the stuff I heard at at festivals and stuff where I was singing festivals, you know, like even that stuff, like, you know, it was all golden age, like we sang all golden age stuff. Of course we did, right? We never, no one was saying anything even remotely like non-golden age. So we had all of those. That was the specific sound that I had in my ear. So I think a lot of times as teachers too, we're not. It's that we have not examined what we think of when we think of healthy. It's that as well, but it's also that our intuitive understanding of a developing voice is based on a Western classical developing voice, not on a pop singer and not on a music theater singer, right? So we don't have this intuitive understanding of what those voices go through as they, you know, as they develop and as they mature. So then we get a little scared when we hear those sounds and we're like, oh, that can't be good. But we hear the same sounds in all developing voices and all things. And so it's just the journey. So let's figure out the options and give folks the options. Okay, I've talked long enough. Yes, it is long enough. 40 minutes is long enough. If you would like to join me next week, Tuesday and Wednesday, I'm going to talk in a much more structured manner. I think so too, Christy. Yeah, I think that is also that is a total, like, so Christy says, isn't it interesting how our exposure shapes our understanding of right and wrong? Yeah, and I mean, I think we can't discount the fact that, you know, especially if we went through that Western classical pipeline, we definitely got the message that Western classical was the healthiest and the properest and the bestest, right? We definitely got that message. But I also think, like, I never heard the journey of someone who was a music theater singer through high school. I never heard that journey, and I never heard the journey of someone who's like a rock star. I never heard that journey, or a singer-songwriter. I never saw that journey, right? So I only saw the sort of Western classical journey. So yeah, so my intuitive understanding is, I think it's shaped by that for sure. Now that is totally anecdotal. That's just like something I think. I don't know for sure. I have no idea. I don't know if there may be a double-blind study somewhere, but just totally what I think. So take it for what it's worth. If it resonates, amazing. Okay, if you want to join me next week, Tuesday and Wednesday, we're going to be talking in a way more structured manner, especially on Tuesday. Wednesday, going to be panel talking about working with contemporary singers, popular music singers. I hope you'll join me if you get a chance. Take good care. Have a terrific weekend. It's Friday. Yeah. Have a terrific weekend. Take care.